one thing that is clear is that there's been a lot of denial about what took place in Nazi Germany, and it's time that the historical record be made clear, and that's what I set out to do in the book many years ago. I actively wrote the book and did research for it for about 15 years, because being that the sources are either in English or German, published sources don't deal with this topic, it was necessary to do a lot of archival research in Germany. I did some myself. I also retained one of the best archival researchers in Germany who does this topic, who knows these record groups very well. And we came to some very interesting conclusions that are presented in the book. But historically, the way it all started was right at the end of the Great War. 1918, 1919, there were communist uprisings in Germany. The monarch fell. The Weimar Republic was established, and there was a virtual civil war. And I will do a little bit of show and tell. I don't have any of the street scenes to show you from that period, but if you've ever seen any documentaries on it, you'll see people running every which way and machine guns in the streets and the steel helmets and the Freikorps, which was the basically voluntary group that sided with the government to repress the communist uprisings. They wanted an uprising that had taken place in Russia, a Bolshevik-type coup. And so there was quite a lot of chaos. And then under the Versailles Treaty, there was the idea in Germany that either all arms or all military arms had to be surrendered, including by civilians. So there were actually legal interpretations in Germany that no civilian could own any gun and they all had to be turned in. And there were actually court cases about this during the early 1920s. But things calmed down somewhat, but then we head to 1923, you have the Great Inflation, and you have a communist uprising in Hamburg, which was ruthlessly put down, and then you have Hitler's beer hall putsch in Munich, where they actually seized a beer hall, but they didn't succeed in seizing the state. Interesting phenomenon. It would probably be pretty easy to seize a beer hall in this country. But so then he goes and writes Mein Kampf when he's in prison, and things calmed down a lot after that, though. In 1928, however, the Reichstag passed a Waffengesetz, or gun control law, that was the first of its kind in Germany, and it required a lot of record keeping. There was no registration system, but there were records to be kept that could be subject to police inspection. And a curious thing about it is there was no debate in the legislature or the Reichstag. It passed without any debate whatever, which would be a phenomenon in itself. But things started getting rearing up again as we approached the 30s. And in 1931, for the first time, Germany adopted a legislation or a decree. There were legislative decrees that the executive branch could make, and it called for a registration of the German states that adopted it. So you had, like, Berlin and most of the large jurisdictions adopting firearm registration, and some areas did not do so, but by and large most places did. Because in 1931, but before this took place, there were the Nazi Party had declared itself in favor of legal elections by that point, but there was an incident there was a hotel called Boxheimer, and there was an individual named Werner Best who was a Nazi theoretician, and he was heavily involved with the SA, the stormtroopers, and the document had purported to deal with if there was a communist revolt and the Nazis needed to seize power, which many people interpreted to mean this was a plan for a Nazi seizure of power. And it had things like there would be rationing of food, Jews would not get any food supplies, and it had a provision that everyone would be ordered to turn in their firearms within 24 hours or they would be executed. So this individual, Werner Best, actually would go on to become an official in the Gestapo, and we'll hear from him a little bit more this evening. But these documents were discovered, and they weren't taken too seriously. Nonetheless, there was still a lot of street fighting going on between the communists and the Nazis. They were basically armed thugs in the streets. And so it was decided in December of 1931 that the executive branch would decree this firearm registration legislation. Now, at that time, the Republic, the executive branch could rule by decree. You hear a lot about executive decrees today. Well, this allowed the executive branch basically to not bother consulting the legislative branch at all and simply make decrees, and this was one of them. In fact, this decree covered a lot of subjects, and the Reichskanzler at that time, Heinrich Brüning, basically the head of the German government, and there was something called the Enabling Act, which allowed the executive branch, as I said, to issue these decrees, and that's what he did, and that was one thing that the Weimar Republic adopted that was a horrible precedent, because when the Nazis came to power, they could rule by decree just as well. And so this one particular decree, if I can move to that, this is like the decree about internal security, and it's about misuse of weapons. But when you look at the first provisions, this section 1 provided for registration of all firearms by all people. And then it had a provision 2 here, which stated that anytime the officials, the authorities decided it was needed for public security, they could require everybody who registered their firearms to turn them in. Now that's an interesting thing to put in a firearm registration law. It was quite honest, wasn't it, that they would admit, because when you have firearm basically registration debated and proposed, that's always, we'll never confiscate them. Well, here they had it right in the law that the authorities can decree it's a public emergency and they have to confiscate all firearms, and there's a duty to turn them in, and you'll be incarcerated if you don't. So that came down in right before Christmas of '31, and the equivalent to our Attorney General, the Interior Minister, Wilhelm Görner, sent out a directive saying that you have to be very careful with these registration records. This went to the officials who were keeping them. We don't want them to fall into the hands of extremist groups or radical elements. And so he actually said, don't keep them at the local police departments, put them in more centralized facilities for safekeeping. And so that was the directive, and I assume that's what they did. They didn't have computers, obviously, at that time. But they did get the IBM punch card technology by the time the Nazis came into power. How many of you remember that? I remember those very well. There was a lot of that technology in our own lifetime still, before all this electronic business. So, but they could collate registration records for gun owners or Jews or Protestants, Catholics, the whole works. They had all the records on everything. So 1933, Hitler and his party comes to power, and they immediately start attacking physically their political enemies. That would be Social Democrats, the party who had probably had more power than any other during the Weimar period as a single party, but also liberal parties, conservative parties. They multiplied day by day. The more opposition that arose, the more this repression would happen. And all opposition was invariably called communist, so that if you opposed what the Nazis were doing, you were a communist. And if you read the newspapers at that time, you'll find on a daily basis accounts of searches and seizures of firearms and arrest of so-called communists. So that goes on 1933, and you had the use of the firearm records. I have a whole chapter actually on this, the case of Brandenburg, where I got the records of a directive from Hermann Göring came down, who was a high official in the Nazi regime, and he basically said you need to check the political reliability of all persons with firearm permits. And so I actually found records where local authorities went through and they would give a name and they would say what that person's profession was and whether he was politically reliable. if he's a social democrat, he's not, and his weapon permit's going to be confiscated as well as his gun. And then you go down the list, and I found there was one Jew where they wanted to take his weapon permit, but there was another one where they actually let him keep it, at least for that point. So political reliability meant that you supported Nazism or National Socialism, and that you were not politically reliable if you did not. And so these were actually records not from the registration of guns, but from the licensing. People who had licensed permits to possess guns, to carry guns, to purchase guns, things like that, or ammunition. So there was some repression against Jews in 1933. It was not as harsh as against the political opponents because the dictatorship wanted to consolidate its power. It was basically use of the law and physical force and every means necessary to make sure that the Nazi Party became supreme. Because for all anybody knew in those days, it would be just another temporary government. During the Weimar Republic, the governments would rise and fall very quickly. Sometimes maybe they would be in power a couple of years, and sometimes maybe just a few weeks. So Adolf Hitler wanted to make sure that his power was consolidated, and you had the Reichstag fire and more emergency decrees to justify there's this communist insurrection that's going to go on, so we've got to ban free speech, assembly, things like that. But by the way, the Weimar Republic did a lot of the same thing. The registration law, if you go to the provisions after gun registration, it was no public assemblies and no free speech. You could not make politically subversive speeches. So these things seem to go together. But there was one case, there was more than one case, but one famous case of a search and seizure operation against Jews in Germany. This was in April of 1933. There were raids that took place in the Jewish quarter in Berlin. And here's actually some illustration. This picture and the next one I'll show you are illustrations of that raid. This is from the Nazi paper, the Völkisch Beobachter. And basically it says, raid in the Jewish quarter. And if you read the article that follows, it talks about the subversive literature that was seized and the guns that were seized in this search and seizure operation. And here you see a number of uniformed police. That's in the Jewish part of Berlin at that time. And so basically it was kind of more of a sideshow, the repression of Jews at that time. But the biggest actions were against the so-called communists or political opponents. And the second illustration from the same article, that's an elderly Jewish man, and the guy on the left is a criminal police inspector interrogating him, and you see the little square in front of them, that's radio. And so they're broadcasting this interview, and the Nazis were masters of propaganda, and so they're putting this raid on the radio, and they're basically depicting it as, these Jews, they shouldn't be in the country, and here's this old man, and he pretends that he doesn't know why he's being arrested and interrogated. I mean, you're supposed to get it, right? That, well, he's a Jew, he shouldn't have a gun, he shouldn't have this subversive literature and all that. So that's an example of some of the repression going on then, but as time goes by in the coming months, it gets more internal because you have, the Nazi Party was like a criminal gang, so you had Hitler wanting absolute power. In 1934, you have him basically wiping out in the Night of the Long Knives the SA leadership, Ernest Röhm and others. So it becomes